So, in today's lesson, what I wanted to talk about was inflation and commoditization, which are very much related to the P, that's price in the four P's of marketing. Um, so, inflation, as we all know from the last couple of years, is a very real phenomenon. And we have seen we saw a couple of years ago very, very high inflation, which led to much higher prices. So, a reminder that inflation refers to the growth and increase of prices, not the actual prices themselves. Um, so, for example, in the last couple of years, inflation actually has not been particularly high, but inflation rarely turns around. You rarely see prices going down. Because there's a lot of things that are driving inflation. I mean, there's the cost of the actual goods, but there's the cost of labor. And as inflation goes up, we have to pay people more. And you can't really very well sort of dial back and turn back people's wages once you've started paying them at a higher level. And so inflation is persistent, or sorry, price increases are persistent. Inflation refers to how much prices are increasing at any given moment. The reality, though, is even in a good inflationary moment, that prices are going up. In fact, in order for economy to be healthy, there's always a certain level of inflation that you would expect to have happen. And if you go below that inflation, you actually end up getting into sort of recessionary territory, which is even worse in some ways than the prices going up, because you start to cool off demand and so forth. So a small amount of inflation is good. A lot of inflation is obviously very troubling and really impacts people who are trying to make ends meet and trying to keep up with increasing prices, but also impacts companies trying to keep their prices high enough so that they can continue to make a margin, a decent margin, when all of their goods and labor and so forth are going up. So inflation is very real. And so when we talk about the four P's of marketing, we often talk about price as if we sort of set it and forget it. And then we sort of added in, the next piece, which was that in the short term, we sometimes, move the price up or down because there's a sale or a BOGO or whatever. But the reality is there are long-term pressures on price that lead us to have to increase our the dollar amount that we're charging people, even if if you were to look at sort of consistent dollar amounts from year to year and adjust for inflation, we may actually not be spending as much on something as we were in the past, or we might be spending the same as we were in the past, adjusted for inflation. But the prices are going up, and so you have to increase your price in order to keep up with this, or you won't have that margin, right? You won't be profitable. The problem that companies run into is that they get stuck at certain price points. So, for Hershey, for a very long time, for their what they call standard bars, the bars that the Hershey bars or whatever that you buy in, say, a convenience store or at the front end in a supermarket, they didn't want to cross the threshold of 99 cents, because once they went, again, that's that left digit thing. If I go over 99 cents, it feels like a really big increase. So they hold off doing that, right? Because they don't want to go over this price threshold. And they want to maintain this sense of value. And you can do that for a while, but if you do it for too long, what's going to end up happening is you start protecting price points, and trying to keep price points, even though the cost of goods and so forth are going up, cost of labor is going up. And so the result is your margin starts to erode. So this happened at Cracker Barrel. They were trying to maintain for many, many years, I think a decade or more, they were trying to maintain a price point of, I think it was $5.99, $4.99 for breakfast. It was like $6 or $7.99 for lunch, and it was $8.99, eventually $9.99 for dinner. But they were trying to protect those price points because they felt like those are the price points that people expected from Cracker Barrel, that they felt were a good value. And so what they were doing was protecting those price points, essentially at all costs. And so what this meant was, it used to be that when you went into a Cracker Barrel, if you ordered a breakfast or whatever, they would put a slice of orange on the plate, to sort of as a garnish, for example. Well, they took the oranges off the plate at some point because they needed to remove some cost. Or maybe sometimes you'll hear about restaurants or products where they decrease the size of the product or they put less product on it. That wasn't what Cracker Barrel was doing, but they were starting to take away things. They started to change the number of servers they had on staff at any given time. They used to have, they had more hours for training servers at one point. They started to eliminate those hours of training because they needed to make up that margin somewhere. And so the result of that was you had servers who weren't quite as well trained as they used to, serving people. And so the quality of the service was going down. And so over time, in order to try and maintain their margin, they were eroding the quality of the food, the quality of the presentation, the quality of the service. And the result of it was that they were maintaining the price point, but they actually weren't maintaining the value, right? The value equation that we've talked about before is what you get for a price that you pay for it. And so it's all fine and good to maintain a low price in order to maintain value. But if you actually start to erode what it is you're offering, the quality becomes worse, the service becomes worse, etc., then you're not actually providing the same value for a lower price. You're providing less value for a lower price. So you have to really understand, does the consumer care about the price more or the value that they're getting more? And so the result of not sort of increasing your prices for inflation over time can be that you sort of, you look at that chart that's on the screen there, or that diagram that's on the screen there, um, is this idea of commoditization, that the product that used to be differentiated and very desirable and have a lot of value for a low price now is just sort of like everyone else. It doesn't have the garnishes, it doesn't have the great service, it doesn't have all these things that made the product differentiated. And so the result of this is that people don't value it as much, and so they stop showing up, right? They stop going to the restaurant. You start losing traffic because they kind of go, well, I can get a mediocre breakfast anywhere, so why am I going to go to a Cracker Barrel? So the chart here says identifying the signs of market disruption caused by commoditization. So often when a product starts to become commoditized, that is, it is undifferentiated from other things in the market, you see price wars. In other words, I'm going to just fight on price. So Cracker Barrel and IHOP and Denny's are all dropping their prices to try and get people to come into their store because basically it's just breakfast and nobody really cares and doesn't see a real difference. Decreased profit margin. We certainly were seeing that in Cracker Barrel before the pandemic. After the pandemic, with a huge, inflationary price increases that we saw in sort of the early, 21, 22 kind of time frame, the profit margins were getting very, very small relative to where they had been before the pandemic. But the price increases that Cracker Barrel would have had to take to kind of offset that, was those at this point were huge because they had not taken price increases for like 10 years, trying to maintain those value price points. And they actually weren't able to decrease the cost of the product enough to offset it. So their margin was decreasing. Innovation stagnation. Like, I don't do anything new, I don't do anything different because I don't have the money to spend on things like R&D or whatever it is. Increased competition, right? New players come into the market when they see, hey, this person's getting commoditized, so I can come in and actually offer a better, something that is more of value at a higher price. And so an example of this, I think I've mentioned before, the restaurant First Watch is a breakfast restaurant that has popped up in the South, and sort of taken some of Cracker Barrel's business, because it used to be that Cracker Barrel was the place where you went to have a really, great service and a quality breakfast relative to, say, Denny's and IHOP. And now it's sort of just the same as Denny's and IHOP. It's commoditized. And so now people go to this other restaurant called First Watch. and they are growing, one of the fastest growing restaurant chains in the country as a result, meaning First Watch is. Increased competition, and the last piece is lack of brand differentiation. So what was it that the things that you take away in order to sort of manage costs often are the things that set you apart. So having that orange on the plate maybe isn't that important in the grand scheme of things, but if you have hundreds of little things like that that you take away from the experience, then people kind of go, this is kind of like everything else. There's nothing different here. And they stop feeling like this is special. And so you are essentially losing your ability to deliver on that value-based pricing, and you get sort of sucked down into competitive pricing and cost-based pricing only. So the summary notes on the right there are that commoditization occurs when competitive offerings become indistinguishable. That's sort of the meaning of commoditization, where the product is a commodity. You often hear about commodities in a supermarket. Typically, produce is a commodity, right? You have no idea, generally speaking, what brand of I don't know, whatever strawberries you're buying. There are some brands in the strawberry world, but for the most part, nobody really cares what they are. It's a commodity. A strawberry is a strawberry is a strawberry, right? You do see sometimes in the produce world that people try to brand, fruits and vegetables and so forth, like, there's Chiquita bananas, there's Halos, Clementine oranges. They try to create some branding to see if they can differentiate enough to actually get a higher price. But for the most part, when you're looking at those kinds of products, they are commoditized, meaning nobody really cares what brand of strawberries they bought for the most part. So the result is that strawberry growers and strawberry sellers can't really command a higher price for their products. So that's sort of the next bullet is, when commoditization happens, the competition basically becomes based on price only, meaning you're no longer able to command a higher price based on value because everything's kind of the same and it's just competition. And if the competition drops their price, you have to drop their price as well. Marketing's role in many ways is to fight this process, this sort of natural process of inflation causing, erosion of value and commoditization. Marketing's role in many ways is to fight this process by constantly demonstrating value and uniqueness. And when I say value, I don't mean the value like the price is low. I mean what it is that you get as opposed to what is it that you're going to pay for it. I have to constantly add value. And that's why you see that, say Apple, for example, is constantly innovating and adding features to its phones and so forth. It's interesting, right, to look at what's going on with Apple now, because the features they're adding to their phone just don't seem all as that different as they used to. And so the result is, probably that, people are more willing to consider alternative phones, right? So you have to constantly do these things to kind of create this sense of this brand is unique, this brand is different, this brand is worth paying more for. And if you can't do that by essentially properly positioning your product as uniquely solving a problem for your customers, then you will become a commodity and you will not be able to command that premium price. You won't be able to do value-based pricing. It's a very real set of things that happen with products in companies. So we often people don't talk about this from a marketing perspective, but it is very important to understand how prices have to change over time and the importance of that relationship between the ability to charge a higher price and the ability to continue to offer a higher level of value that people are willing to pay for. So I mentioned this already. My example of this is Cracker Barrel. So Cracker Barrel has 1,600 billboards around the country, and they, for many, many years, have often put price points on those billboards. In this case, you have dinners starting at $7.99. And what I was telling you before was they were trying to maintain those price points in the face of, years and years of inflation, sort of, let's say from the year 2010 until kind of the early 2020s. They were trying to maintain those price points, and it finally got to the point where they're like, well, we have to actually push these price points up, and at some point they got up to $8.99 and then $9.99, but they were still very hesitant because they didn't want to go over $10, and so they hesitated and they waited. And what ended up happening is you ended up with this this erosion of quality of service, quality of product, etc. So the summary on the right there again is inflation is a very real challenge for businesses. Constant price increases can erode customer value perception. Their belief that this is worth it is impacted by the price going up. Companies use many approaches to try to maintain their key price points, these very important price points. Again, this $7.99 or 99 cents candy bar or whatever it is. And they will sometimes do things like decreasing the size of product or decreasing the quality of the product. And you often notice it. Just as an example, when I worked at Nabisco, there was a story that somebody told me about how they had slowly decreased the quality of the ingredients in Fig Newtons. And what they would do is they would take a Fig Newton and they would change the ingredients to slightly cheaper ingredients, and they would test to see if they were statistically the same according to consumers. And they would find, all right, this is statistically the same. So they would go to the cheaper ingredients. Now they would take that new Fig Newton a couple years later and take some other ingredient and cheapen that ingredient. And they would do statistical tests and find out that statistically they were the same. And they did this over and over and over again. But what they weren't doing was testing the product. So they were using this to kind of maintain the price point by decreasing the quality of the product. Maybe a couple times they took the number of cookies down, they changed the weight of the product, etc. They kept sort of slowly eroding the value. And what they weren't doing was testing the new product against the original product. Let's call that the gold standard product, the product that we started with. And so the result was that you had a product that if you were to test it against the original, the gold standard, you would find that there was a statistically significant difference in how good that product tasted, how, whether it was too dry, all those things, whatever. And so they had slowly eroded the value of the product without realizing it without sort of acknowledging it, because statistically speaking, it was always about the same as the previous version. So this is a way that, companies can get themselves into real trouble. You'll see, like, sometimes you'll have a product like, this isn't the same product that I had when I was a kid. Sometimes it really isn't the same product that you had when you were a kid, because they've changed the ingredients. They've tried to make it cheaper so that they can maintain lower price points. And the result of that is a worse product. And they start to lose customers who kind of go, this isn't what I expect from this brand. In other words, back to something that we talked about before, it erodes trust, right? When you go into a Cracker Barrel and you don't get the same quality of service and you don't get the same quality of product, you don't trust Cracker Barrel anymore. And so when you see an ad for Cracker Barrel, like, yeah, it used to be great, but it's just not great anymore. And that's what starts to happen. You start to see sort of weakening demand. Again, this sort of process of commoditization, that erodes, sort of the sense that this is at all different from all the other products out there. So the last bullet there is commoditization is a real risk if companies constantly erode value in order to maintain price. Again, the whole point here is the prices will go up of the inputs, the labor, the cost of, of the ingredients, etc. Those prices are going to go up. And how you deal with that is really important, because if you deal with it by always trying to maintain the price of your product, but by eroding the quality of the product that you're delivering, eventually nobody's going to buy your product anymore.